everyone, and welcome to another episode of Accessibility. It's a show on YouTube where I talk about the video game industry, accessibility, and representation. Basically, how can we help more people to play games, and more people to see themselves in the games they play? A little over a decade ago, I was diagnosed with an autism spectrum condition. It runs in my family. Both my younger brothers have autism spectrum conditions as well, and the way that they affect us differs between us. Autism is a spectrum condition, and the ways it affects people varies from person to person. Different symptoms get different people to differing degrees. In my life, autism manifests in a couple of ways. I get really overwhelmed by large amounts of sensory information. I get overwhelmed with unexpected changes in plans and routines, and I really struggle to pick out non-verbal social cues and the unwritten bits of conversations. That's what we're here to talk about today. Now, with effort, I can usually pick these things out. If you show me a photograph of a smiling face or a frowning face, I know what they mean. It's not like it's invisible to me, I don't understand what they mean, but in real time in conversations, I often miss out on a lot of the little nuances, the blink and you'll miss it bits of unsaid conversation. And as true as that is for real-world conversations, it's just as true for media I consume. So often, when I am watching a movie or playing a video game or anything that has a visual component, I often miss a lot of the little nuances that aren't said but are shown, because with effort I can pick those things out. I know what they are, they just take so much effort for me to spot, and even when I'm making an effort, a lot of them just fly right past me. I bring this up because a couple of weeks ago, Marvel's Avengers launched on PC, PS4, and Xbox One, and at certain points in the game's subtitles, it included subtitles for non-verbal cues. And regardless of what your opinion is on the game itself, I was really intrigued and fascinated by seeing non-verbal subtext cues turning up in a AAA game's subtitles. So, today we're going to talk about the non-verbal subtext cues in Marvel's Avengers. We're going to talk about what they got right, what they probably could have improved, and why there was some pushback from some players on the autism spectrum who didn't enjoy their inclusion. The first time I noticed that Marvel's Avengers was including non-verbal subtext in its subtitles was a couple of hours into the game's story mode. I'm going to be talking very mild plot details from here on out, so you have been warned. Kamala Khan, aka Miss Marvel, was taking a short road trip with Bruce Banner through the desert. It's a pretty short scene, but it's largely wordless, and most of its story is told through non-verbal interactions. Kamala is restless and bored as the pair drive through the desert. She finishes her large, sugary drink and slurps at the end of the ice, causing Bruce to look at her with a quick glance of frustration. Kamala turns on the radio and enjoys a pop song, before Bruce quickly turns it off. Kamala slurps her drink again, this time directly aimed at Bruce, in an attempt to annoy him in retaliation for him turning off her music. Bruce closes his eyes for slightly longer than a standard blink, again to express frustration at his predicament. It's a very short scene, and ultimately not terribly important in the grand scheme of the game's narrative, but it does set up for later in the narrative the fact that Bruce is frustrated with looking after Kamala, and he's looking to offload her on someone as soon as he gets a chance. The scene in question lays out several of these non-verbal cues in its subtitles, and I really appreciated having that information there. The fact that Kamala was deliberately slurping at Bruce flew right past me, and I never would have picked up on the fact that Bruce's blink length was of narrative importance. It's these little details that I sometimes don't pick up on, and having them spelled out really helped me to get the most from that particular scene. Now, these non-verbal subtitles are not applied consistently throughout Marvel's Avengers, which limits how ultimately useful they are. They're used to great effect in scenes like this, where the non-verbal subtext of the scene is the scene's full narrative, but they're often absent in scenes where dialogue is present. Their implementation in Marvel's Avengers is largely a matter of fitting them in where there is space to fill, rather than considering them a useful accessibility option, but I was still happy to see them every time they popped up. Now, it's no secret that I really appreciated having those non-verbal subtext cues included in Marvel's Avengers, and I really benefited from them, but it's important to note that they weren't handled perfectly. There was a lot of pushback from certain groups who really didn't enjoy their inclusion in the game, and I think it's important that we note that they definitely were not for everyone, and there were things that could have been changed to make them work better for a larger variety of people. Firstly, and I think this was a big part of the pushback seen to the game's non-verbal cue subtitles, they were bundled into the game's default subtitle option, with no way to separate them out. If you're a player who is hard of hearing, but not autistic, you may want subtitles on to keep up with dialogue, but not need to be told what a character is thinking. If you put on subtitles, you're getting these non-verbal cue subtitles too, and while that's great for players like myself, who really benefit from both dialogue and non-verbal scene cues, I get why their inclusion confused some players. Most players don't need to be told that a long blink is a sign of frustration, and feel a bit weird having it pointed out to them. This could have potentially been solved by having a couple of different subtitles options, as many games already do. Strictly dialogue subtitles, dialogue plus sound effect descriptions, or dialogue, sound effects, and non-verbal subtext descriptions, for example, would allow players to tailor which information they want presented while playing. Secondly, there was pushback from some autistic players who were able to pick up on non-verbal cues presented by the game without the need for subtitle explanations, and found their presence in the game a little patronising. To those players, all I can say is, I'm really glad you were able to pick up on those nuances without being prompted. I wasn't. Autism is a spectrum, and we all need help in different areas. Not every autistic person will benefit from these little non-verbal explainers, but some of us, like myself, do. Lastly, and I sort of touched on this earlier, some degree of consistency would have made these subtitles a lot more useful. I have to assume this was included as a deliberate attempt to make the game more accessible, but it's used incredibly sparingly. You could have subtitle lines optionally start with bracketed words, explaining that a line is being delivered sarcastically or in resigned defeat, for example. You could explain the emotion driving someone to pace back and forth across a room. There are so many moments where a couple of words would really help to make a scene more accessible for players like myself. Autism is a spectrum condition, and no set of accessibility features is ever going to help 100% every person on the autism spectrum. It's the difficulty you have with a spectrum condition. So I would never want to see subtitles like this labelled as autism subtitles, but I really appreciated having them there in Marvel's Avengers, and I think if a game could take what Marvel's Avengers did, fleshed it out, labelled it properly, and found a good way to separate it out from general subtitles, I think this could be something really useful for a lot of disabled players. If I were to see a game separate these out from regular subtitles to label them something like non-verbal subtext subtitles, use them consistently throughout the whole game, and I would love that. I would love to see that be a thing in games. It wouldn't take much to make this an accessibility feature that I would opt into if given the choice. So often, when we think about supporting people with autism and their consumption of media, we look at that support through a really limited range of the things we've done before. I really appreciate that autism-friendly screening exists, for example. I really appreciate that someone made an effort to think about sensory information that might cause problems for people and make that less of a barrier to consuming media. But this is the first time I can think of where I've seen a piece of media help other aspects of me as an autistic person that have gone out of their way to say, you struggle with the text of the media you're consuming, let's put some of that on the table. And that was a wonderful feeling, to feel included, to have just a little extra help to not miss those nuances of what are happening in conversations. And I would love to see this be something that in future developers think about, because it was really wonderful, if briefly, to get to experience it in Marvel's Avengers.